When a young wife is found hanging in her cellar, Miss Marple quietly unravels the illusion of suicide to expose a husband whose love was nothing more than control disguised as devotion. Welcome to the Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I am so glad you joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are tuning in from. We love hearing from mystery lover from all over the world. A Cry in the Cellar. Chapter 1. A quiet house in Elmford Lane. Elmford was the sort of suburb that liked to imagine itself a village. Its lanes were lined with tidy hedges, the air always faintly perfumed with lavender and cut grass, and every house seemed to wear its curtains with a sense of quiet propriety. The residents spoke in low voices about local news, seldom about anything as vulgar as tragedy. That is, until the evening when the Allens' calm, red-brick home became a scene of muffled panic. Miss Jane Marple, who was spending a brief holiday with her goddaughter, Mrs. Judith Cray, heard the commotion from across the lane. She had been sitting in the conservatory, darning a pair of pale grey gloves, when the first police car whispered past. The blue light flickered against the rain-spotted glass like an errant candle. Within minutes, another car followed, then an ambulance. Miss Marple set down her sewing with a soft, thoughtful sigh. "Something unpleasant, I'm afraid," she murmured. "People rarely drive that quickly in Elmford unless they've done something dreadful, or discovered that someone else has." Judith looked up from her crossword. "It's the Allens' house, Aunt Jane. Jimmy and Amy Allen. Perfectly ordinary couple, I think. He works for some design firm, and she's at home mostly. Keeps cats. Their little girl goes to the grammar school." Miss Marple's pale eyes lingered on the reflected light through the window. "Ordinary couples are, in my experience, quite extraordinary once you look closely," she said mildly. By the time the clock struck 9, the drizzle had thickened into a steady rain, and the narrow lane was gleaming darkly under the lamps. 2 constables guarded the Allens' gate, their silhouettes rigid in the downpour. A small knot of neighbours had gathered despite the weather, whispering in the half-light. Elmford's sense of decency had given way to curiosity. Miss Marple arrived quietly under her small black umbrella, as if by coincidence. She nodded to the constables with the courteous assurance of a woman who had seen tragedy before. Inside the house, a heavy stillness had settled. The scent of damp concrete drifted up from the basement door that stood ajar. In the kitchen, Jimmy Allen sat at the table, his face pale beneath the harsh light. He was trembling, not with grief, but with the brittle exhaustion of a man performing grief for too long. His eyes were reddened but dry, and his breathing came in short, rehearsed gasps. An officer stood beside him, asking gentle questions. "You say you found her yourself, sir?" Jimmy's hands clutched a half-empty glass of water. "Yes, down there in the cellar. I thought she'd fainted, tried to help her. I called right away." His voice broke at the edges. Yet somewhere in the rhythm of his speech, Miss Marple caught a tiny dissonance. The words were chosen too carefully, the pauses deliberate, as though he were quoting himself from memory. Inspector Graves, a large, square-shouldered man, entered and glanced up the staircase where 2 paramedics moved quietly. "She's gone," he said at last, his tone steady but respectful. "We'll have her taken to St. Agatha's for post-mortem." Jimmy Allen gave a strangled sound, half sob, half exhalation. His hand moved suddenly, sweeping a bowl of crisps off the table, scattering them like yellow petals across the tiles. Why would she do this?" he cried hoarsely. "She was happy. She was fine. She couldn't." The words rang oddly theatrical in the small, warm kitchen. Miss Marple, who had taken up a quiet place near the door, noted the detail with interest, the violence of a gesture made when one believes oneself watched. An hour later, the house had emptied of officials. The rain had ceased, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and the faint, metallic scent of the cellar. Miss Marple lingered politely behind, speaking softly to Mrs. Cray, who had offered to bring the poor man some tea. When Judith stepped into the pantry, Miss Marple turned her attention to the hallway. A pair of muddy boots stood by the stair, their soles oddly clean, except for a smear of grey dust near the heel. She bent slightly, eyes sharp, then straightened as the inspector appeared behind her. "Ah, Miss Marple, isn't it? We met in St. Mary Mead, I think." "Inspector Graves." "Indeed," she said pleasantly. "Such a sad business, Inspector. One can't help noticing how still the air is in this house. Even grief seems to echo here." Graves gave a small grunt. "Husband says it's suicide. Argument earlier. She went downstairs. Low beam in the cellar, cord found nearby. No real injuries apart from a faint mark on the neck. It happens more than one would think." Said Miss Marple softly. "But I imagine it would be rather difficult, hanging oneself properly from such a low beam, unless one were remarkably short. Mrs. Allen was not, I believe." The inspector looked faintly amused. "We'll measure it, of course. Still nothing else to suggest foul play at present." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Quite so. Only people do the strangest things, don't they, when they wish to appear normal? Why, I once knew a woman who fainted dramatically at church every Sunday, just so her husband would hold her arm on the way home." Graves gave a polite chuckle, taking the remark as harmless, but Miss Marple's gaze remained thoughtful, fixed upon the narrow stairway that led down to the cellar. Outside, Elmford Lane was silent again. The neighbours had gone indoors. The rainwater glittered in the streetlights. Miss Marple stood a moment beneath the hedge, listening to the muted hum of the ambulance as it rolled away into the distance. Somewhere within the house, a single lamp still burned in an upstairs window, a pale square of light against the dark. She sighed, drawing her shawl a little closer around her shoulders. "So tidy, so respectable," she murmured to herself. "And yet there is always one drawer in every household that no one wishes opened." As she walked back toward the vicarage, her mind moved quietly, assembling fragments like pieces of sewing laid out upon her lap. A husband whose tears fell without moisture, a faint mark upon the neck, a cellar beam too low for death by design, and a village that would whisper itself into certainty by morning. Miss Marple, however, never whispered. She merely observed. And in Elmford that night she had observed enough to know that Mrs. Allen's death was not the tidy tragedy. Chapter 2. The Cry in the Basement. The next morning dawned with a pale, watery sunlight that seemed reluctant to touch Elmford Lane. A thin mist clung to the hedges and the quiet roofs, softening the edges of things, as though the whole village were politely pretending that tragedy had not visited it the night before. Miss Marple sat by the breakfast table in Mrs. Cray's bright kitchen, spooning marmalade onto toast with deliberate care. Judith had the morning paper open, reading the small column about local woman found dead in basement tragedy. It was, as Miss Marple thought wryly, the sort of headline that makes the reader frown for half a second before moving on to the crossword. "They've written it as a possible suicide," Judith said, shaking her head. "Poor Amy Allen, such a shame. Jimmy's been with the police since dawn. They say he's completely shattered." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly above her teacup. "Shattered men," she said gently, "are often curiously composed once no one is watching." Judith looked startled. "Aunt Jane, you can't suspect." "My dear, I suspect nothing," Miss Marple replied calmly. "I merely noticed that some people grieve as though they were auditioning for sympathy, while others say nothing at all. I've always trusted the silent ones far more." At mid-morning, the air began to hum with quiet activity. The police had returned to Elmford Lane to make further inquiries. Miss Marple, wearing her pale lavender coat and sensible hat, decided that a short stroll for her constitution might naturally take her past the Allens' residence. The house looked different in daylight, ordinary again, almost dull. The front garden, neatly kept, showed no sign of the chaos that had swept through it the night before. Yet Miss Marple noticed something subtle. The curtains in the front sitting-room had been hastily drawn unevenly, as though closed in a trembling hurry. A sign, perhaps, of nerves rather than grief. Inspector Graves stood by his car, conferring with a young constable who carried a clipboard. He looked up as she approached, a hint of a weary smile crossing his face. "Ah, Miss Marple, taking your morning walk, I see. I suppose news travels fast in quiet streets." "Indeed, Inspector, faster than the milk delivery and often less reliable." She smiled disarmingly. "You've been terribly patient with that poor man. I hope he's resting." Graves gave a grunt. He's giving his statement, repeats the same story. Argument at the bar, wife walks home, found her hanging in the cellar when he went to fetch her later. But there's something that bothers me. He hesitated. Miss Marple's gaze was encouraging. "Yes?" "The mark on her neck, faint, too faint for the kind of hanging he describes, and there were no real signs of a struggle, no chair knocked over, no cord properly fixed above her height, ceilings barely 7 feet. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I had thought so. I remember ducking my head when I peered down that stairway last night. Such a low ceiling would hardly give one much advantage to suspend oneself, as it were." Graves frowned. "You noticed that, did you?" "My dear Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly, "one can hardly miss it when one is accustomed to cottages built for people smaller than oneself." He chuckled softly. "You've an eye for detail. Wish more of my constables did." Miss Marple's voice lowered a little. "Tell me, was Mrs. Allen's hair disturbed?" "Not particularly. Bit of dust, some loose strands." "Why?" Miss Marple sighed as though speaking to herself. "Because women who mean to die rarely mind their hair, but women who have it pulled by force, well, that leaves its own kind of disorder." The inspector's brows rose. "You think someone helped her along?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that death can be as deceptive as life. And some men, Inspector, are very tidy murderers indeed." Inside the Allens' kitchen, Miss Marple stood politely at the threshold while Graves made notes. The house felt wrong somehow, too orderly for chaos, too scrubbed for grief. Every surface gleamed with the diligence of someone anxious to erase fingerprints of the past. Her eyes fell upon a small photograph on the mantel. Amy Allen, with a little girl of about 12, smiling beneath a garden archway. There was warmth in the woman's eyes, but also something else, a certain restraint, as though the smile were half borrowed from politeness. Jimmy Allen entered just then, his hair damp, his face pale and drawn. He looked at Miss Marple with the weary curiosity of a man trying to remember who everyone was. "Mrs. Cray's aunt, isn't it? Thank you for coming. It's been awful." His tone was practiced grief. Miss Marple gave him a kind, grandmotherly look. "My dear Mr. Allen, you've suffered a terrible shock. It's kind of you to still receive visitors." He shrugged faintly. "Police wanted me here. Can't leave yet. They've got forms." As he spoke, his gaze wandered restlessly about the room, never lingering on any object for long. When it did settle, momentarily, it was on the cellar door, still closed, but not locked. His hand twitched slightly, almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple noticed. "Forgive me," she said gently, "but your wife, she seemed so young. It must be very difficult to understand why." Jimmy's jaw tightened. "She was unpredictable sometimes. Private. I think maybe she drank too much last night, got emotional. She had moods." "Moods," Miss Marple repeated softly. Such a harmless little word. And yet it explains so many things when people wish it to. He gave a small, brittle laugh. "You sound like the police. They keep asking if we argued. We didn't. I mean, we did, but not like that." "Married people often quarrel," Miss Marple said, her eyes gently steady on his face. "The tone of a quarrel tells more than the words. Some tones bruise long after the voice has gone silent." Jimmy stared at her, uncertain whether she was comforting or accusing him. She smiled faintly, the picture of grandmotherly serenity, and asked no more questions. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire at Mrs. Cray's house, a small notebook on her lap. The radio murmured softly, some news about train delays and a stray dog rescued in Kent. Outside, the lamps burned dimly through a rising fog. She wrote 2 neat lines. Ceiling too low for suicide. Mark faint. Husband's tears inconsistent. She paused, tapping the pencil gently against her chin. Then added another. Smudge of dust on boot heel, cement grey. From Cellar? Her eyes softened with thought. Such a sad little household, she murmured aloud. And yet the saddest thing of all is not that Mrs. Allen died, but that she may have tried to live quietly in fear for so long. Judith entered with a tray of cocoa. Still thinking about that poor woman, Aunt Jane? Yes, my dear, Miss Marple said, folding her notebook. Because when a woman's life is arranged so neatly by another's will, her death, however it comes, is rarely an accident. And in the silence that followed, the old clock in the hallway struck 9, its sound echoing faintly like the memory of a distant cry, one that might still linger beneath the cellar floor of the house on Elmford Lane. Seemed. Chapter 3. The Husband Who Wept Too Loudly. By the second morning after Amy Allen's death, Elmford Lane had returned to its usual, well-mannered routine. The milk bottles stood neatly by the doors, the postman whistled as though tragedy had no address, and only the faint hum of gossip lingered like perfume in the hedges. Miss Marple, however, was not deceived by quiet streets. She knew from long experience that when a village ceases to whisper, it is usually because its residents are whispering somewhere else. At the small grocer's shop, Mrs. Draper, round-faced, rosy, and deeply addicted to other people's troubles, was speaking in hushed excitement to anyone who would listen. "They say he was crying fit to flood the whole basement," she told the butcher's wife, her eyes wide with moral astonishment. "All that carrying on, poor man, and not a single tear on his face. My Arthur said it. He saw him. Looked more like he was playing a part, if you ask me." Miss Marple, standing discreetly by the marmalade jars, looked up with mild interest. "A performance of grief, my dear Mrs. Draper," she said kindly, "is sometimes given for the benefit of an audience. It's quite natural in a way. People wish to appear as others expect them to appear." Mrs. Draper flushed slightly, unsure whether she was being rebuked or agreed with. "Well, I suppose so, Miss Marple, but I can't help thinking it's strange. A man doesn't call the police before checking proper if his wife's breathing. My Arthur says he was more interested in telling the tale than saving the lady." Miss Marple gave a faint nod, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she murmured. "Sometimes people talk more easily than they act." Later that afternoon, Inspector Graves paid Miss Marple a visit at Mrs. Cray's house. His large frame filled the doorway, his hat damp from the drizzle. "Still thinking about your theories, Miss Marple?" he asked, half teasing, half curious. "You had me wondering about that cellar beam, you know. I measured it again this morning, 7 feet, 3 inches from the ground. Not much space for a hanging, especially with a woman of Mrs. Allen's height." Miss Marple smiled, pouring him a cup of tea. "Then we must ask ourselves, Inspector, if it was not possible, why would anyone pretend that it was?" He frowned slightly. "You mean he staged it?" "I mean," she replied gently, "that Mr. Allen's story may have been rehearsed long before his wife's death. People like Mr. Allen, methodical, proud, meticulous, rarely improvise." Graves looked intrigued despite himself. "You've read him well. He's orderly to the point of obsession, keeps diaries for everything, meals, exercise, household chores. Says it helps him stay balanced." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Ah, balance, a word tyrants use when they mean control." She paused, then asked, "And the daughter? How old is she?" 12. Poor girl. Staying with her aunt for now. We'll talk to her again later. She says her parents never argued. I find that hard to believe." "So do I," said Miss Marple softly. No argument leaves silence quite that loud. That evening, Miss Marple took a slow walk along Elmford Lane. The mist hung low, curling around the lamp-posts like old lace. She passed the Allens' house, the curtains drawn, lights dim, and noticed for the first time a pale flicker from an upstairs window. Someone was awake. A moment later, the door opened slightly. A woman stood there, tall, angular, with nervous eyes and a cardigan buttoned unevenly. "You're Mrs. Harker, I believe," said Miss Marple kindly. "Next door?" The woman nodded, hesitant. "Yes, it's been awful, Miss Marple." She smiled. "I'm staying with Mrs. Cray across the lane. We were both quite distressed to hear what happened." Mrs. Harker clasped her hands. "I keep replaying that night. I heard something strange just before the sirens. It sounded like crying, a single cry, muffled, from the basement, then silence. I told the police, but they said it might have been him calling out." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "You're certain it came from the basement?" "Yes, I'm sure. I was in my garden at the time, shutting the shed. It wasn't loud, more like a sob that stopped too suddenly." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the Allens' darkened windows. "It's curious," she murmured, "how truth sometimes hides in the smallest of sounds." Before leaving, she added gently, "If you recall anything else, Mrs. Harker, anything at all, I should be most grateful to know it." The next day, Inspector Graves invited Miss Marple to accompany him to the police station. "We've found something," he said, as the car rolled through the fog. "In a drawer at the Allens' house, a bundle of letters." "Letters?" "Yes, burnt at the edges, as if someone tried to destroy them. Addressed to A, signed only with an initial, G, quite affectionate too. Our people think the wife had a lover. Would explain the quarrel at that bar that evening." Miss Marple's brows lifted, but her voice remained gentle. "And perhaps, Inspector, it might also explain the husband's rage. Jealousy often prefers to cloak itself in righteousness." Graves sighed. "We've no proof yet. But if she was seeing someone else, it gives motive." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Her mind was quietly arranging facts like pieces on a chessboard. The faint bruise, the tidy house, the neighbour's testimony, the too loud sorrow. And now, the letters. She spoke at last. "Tell me, Inspector, did Mr. Allen appear relieved when he learned his wife was still alive?" Graves blinked. "Relieved? Well, I'd say he looked more startled, almost uneasy." "Ah." Miss Marple's tone was soft, almost absent-minded. That sort of unease often follows guilt more quickly than grief does. That evening, back at Mrs. Cray's drawing-room, the fire burned low and the rain had begun again. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, the needles clicking faintly in the quiet. Judith sat opposite, reading the Evening Post. "Aunt Jane," she said suddenly, "do you really think Mr. Allen could have killed his wife? He seems so, well, respectable." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Judith, I once knew a colonel who poisoned his own dog every week just to practice sympathy before murdering his wife. Respectability is a splendid disguise for cruelty." Judith shuddered. "But what about love? Surely he must have loved her once." "Oh, undoubtedly," Miss Marple replied. "But there are people whose love is only an extension of possession. They hold others as they hold their breath, tightly, fearfully, afraid to lose control. When that control slips away, love turns to anger very quickly." She set down her knitting, eyes glinting in the firelight. "I dare say Mr. Allen will weep again soon, Judith. But this time his tears may not be quite so dry." Chapter 4. A Marriage Behind Closed Curtains. For several days, the Allen house sat in uneasy silence, its windows shuttered against daylight as though the building itself were ashamed. The press, having taken what gossip it could, had lost interest, and Elmford Lane began the slow process of pretending life was ordinary again. Yet, for Miss Marple, the quiet only deepened the noise of her thoughts. She had seen such households before, houses where the curtains were always drawn a little too early, and laughter, when it came, sounded rehearsed. To the untrained eye, the Allens' marriage had been the sort of modern domestic success one read about in magazines. A handsome husband, a pleasant home, and a wife who smiled politely at all the right moments. But Miss Marple with her unerring instinct for the subtle and the human, knew that neat appearances were the wallpaper of misery. Inspector Graves came to see her one damp afternoon, his heavy shoes leaving faint prints on Mrs. Cray's tiled hallway. He looked as though he had not slept. "Miss Marple," he began, "we've been digging deeper. The letters we found, turns out the sender's name is George Langford. Married man from Bristol. He and Mrs. Allen were corresponding for nearly 3 years. Seems like they met online first, then a few times in person." Miss Marple poured him tea with her usual calm efficiency. "How sad," she said softly. "A woman starving for kindness often eats the crumbs of attention. Did her husband know?" "That's what we're trying to work out," Graves replied. "He swears he didn't. But his behavior, it's odd. We've had a look at his computer. He was tracking her mobile phone. Seems he liked to know where she went." Miss Marple gave a small sigh. "Men who must know everything their wives do, Inspector, are not curious. They're frightened. Frightened that love, like air, can't be contained in their grasp." Graves rubbed his chin. "We've questioned the daughter again. She's a sweet girl, but withdrawn. Says her mother was quiet, always at home. The only time she seemed truly cheerful was when the father was away." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "So the absence of fear felt like happiness." She looked out of the window, where drizzle traced silver lines down the glass. "You see, Inspector, when a man controls the air a woman breathes, her smile becomes a survival skill. The neighbours see her contentment, not the tremor in her voice when she laughs." The next day, Miss Marple took a walk to Elmford Green, where she happened upon Mrs. Harker again. The woman, relieved to find a sympathetic listener, poured out her recollections eagerly. "You know, Miss Marple," she said, leaning forward, "I used to hear things, not shouting exactly, but tones. You can tell a great deal from a tone, can't you? Sometimes at night there'd be the sound of drawers closing sharply, and once a crash like glass breaking. I'd see her next morning hanging laundry as if nothing happened, but her wrists were red, like she'd been rubbing at them." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression gentle, but her eyes alert. "And did Mr. Allen ever speak to you himself?" "Once or twice, always polite, but cold. The sort of man who looks past you when he's speaking to you. Oh, and this might be nothing, but the day before it happened, I saw her standing in the garden with a letter in her hand. She tore it up before she went back inside. It struck me as odd. She was crying." "That tells us something," Miss Marple said softly. Not what she read, perhaps, but what she had decided. 2 mornings later, Miss Marple was invited to the police station to examine some of Amy Allen's belongings. Inspector Graves thought her observations might help. On the table lay a small silver bracelet, a house key, and a phone, cracked but intact. "The phone's been gone through by our team," said Graves. "Dozens of messages between her and this Langford fellow. They were planning to meet again soon, end of October. She wrote, 'I'm ready to spend time with you in person.'" He replied, "Good, let's do it." Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on the bracelet. "Then perhaps Mr. Allen found those messages," she said quietly. "Men of jealous disposition often seek confirmation of what they already fear, and when they find it, they call it betrayal instead of freedom." Graves nodded grimly. "You think he read them that night?" "Perhaps not," said Miss Marple. "Perhaps earlier. Some men plan their rage as carefully as others plan a holiday. They tell themselves it will only be an argument, a warning, but tempers, once loosed, have a way of doing more damage than intended." She examined the bracelet more closely. It was dented slightly at the clasp. "Do you see, Inspector?" she said, pointing. "The metal is bent inward, not outward. That means it was pulled, not struck. Someone gripped her wrist hard enough to twist it. A quarrel, perhaps." Graves stared at the bracelet, then at her. "By heaven, Miss Marple, you should be running the station." "Oh, dear me, no," she said, with a faint smile. "I much prefer my knitting. Murder is only a pattern, after all. One must simply see where the thread begins to fray. That evening, the police returned to the Allen house to reconstruct the scene. Miss Marple, with quiet persistence, was invited along. She descended the cellar steps slowly, her hand on the railing, her sharp eyes taking in the dimly lit space. The ceiling was low indeed, the beam dark and stained from years of damp. A cord lay coiled on the floor like a sleeping snake. Miss Marple stood beneath the beam, her small frame barely clearing the floor by 2 feet. "She was 5'6", Graves murmured beside her. "She couldn't have hanged herself properly from this height." "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "Her feet would have touched the ground, and if she meant to take her own life, she would not have chosen a place so confined, so humiliating. The cellar is a room for secrets, not for despair." She glanced toward the corner, where a faint smudge marred the wall, a handprint perhaps in dust. Her gaze lingered on it thoughtfully. "Tell me, Inspector, was the husband's shirt that night clean or soiled?" "Clean," Graves replied. "He said he changed it after the ambulance came." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered faintly. Men who commit passionate crimes often wash not just their hands, but their consciences. She turned to face him fully. "No, Inspector, this was not suicide. It was a man's temper, dressed up in panic and regret. The cellar didn't hide a tragedy, it displayed a performance." That night, as rain drummed softly on the roof of Mrs. Cray's house, Miss Marple sat awake, her teacup cooling beside her. Her knitting lay untouched. The fire had burned low, but her mind was alight with thought. She wrote a single note in her small diary. The louder the grief, the quieter the guilt. Chapter 5. The Letter from Florida. The post arrived later than usual that Thursday morning, the envelope damp from drizzle, its ink slightly blurred. Mrs. Cray tossed it beside the teapot, barely noticing. But Miss Marple, whose eyes were keener than most people's consciences, caught the faint handwriting across the top. A foreign return address. Ocala, Florida. The handwriting, neat but uncertain, carried a tremor that spoke of grief. Miss Marple lifted the envelope with gentle curiosity. "Ah," she murmured, "news travels even across oceans when sorrow leads the way." It was addressed to the Elmford Police Department, but Inspector Graves, arriving shortly after breakfast, allowed Miss Marple to open it in his presence. Inside lay a letter, creased and fragile, written in the slanting script of an elderly woman. "Dear officers, my name is Margaret Linton. I am Amy Allen's mother. I only just received the dreadful news about my daughter's death. Amy was a kind, sensitive girl, though I fear her life after marriage was not a happy one. I wish to share what I know, though it pains me deeply. Her husband, Jimmy Allen, was always a controlling man. He separated her from family, from friends, even from her first son, Caleb. He said it was to protect her reputation. Amy called me once, 2 years ago, in tears. She said she was frightened of him. 'Mum,' she told me, 'if anything ever happens to me, promise you'll look deeper than the surface.' The room fell silent. Even Inspector Graves, a man not easily moved, looked grave. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. 'People often leave behind clues not in objects, Inspector, but in the way others remember them. This, I think, is Amy's last cry for help, through her mother's pen.' Graves nodded slowly. 'We'll verify all this. She mentions a son, Caleb. We didn't know about him.' 'Ah, yes,' said Miss Marple softly. 'A child she had before marriage, I dare say. That explains the loneliness. Such things are not forgotten easily by possessive men. Control often begins as protection. That afternoon the inspector traced the address and called the woman. The transatlantic line crackled faintly, but her voice was steady. 'Yes,' she said. 'Amy had a boy before she met Jimmy. My husband and I raised him. When Amy married, she told us Jimmy was kind, but soon after she stopped visiting. We found out later he'd forbidden her from speaking to us. He said her past was shameful.' Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the background, noted each word with meticulous care. The rhythm of the mother's tone was that of someone reciting a wound, long memorized. When the inspector thanked her and hung up, Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "She has been silenced twice," she said softly. "First by the man, and now by the world that refuses to see him for what he is." That evening, the two visited the Allen house once more. The rooms had grown stale, heavy with the odour of neglect and faint perfume, a scent that clung stubbornly to the curtains as though unwilling to leave. Miss Marple paused by the writing desk in the corner of the parlour. There was a locked drawer scratched near the handle. The inspector gave a faint nod, and a constable fetched a small tool. The drawer yielded reluctantly. Inside lay several folded papers, a diary, and a photograph of Amy holding a boy of about 12. Not her daughter, but an older child with familiar eyes. Miss Marple lifted the photograph tenderly. "Caleb," she whispered, "the son who remembered too much." The diary, written in Amy's neat but hurried hand, filled in what the living could not say aloud. June 14th. "He's been angrier lately. Checks my phone, my emails, says I embarrass him when I laugh too loudly. I tell him I'm happy. I don't think he believes me." August 7th. "He says I'm his world, but sometimes it feels like a cage with flowers painted on the bars." September 12th. "He saw a message from George. I thought he'd calm down, but he didn't. He grabbed my wrist. It hurt. He said, 'You belong to me, Amy.' I told him love isn't ownership. He said, 'Then stop pretending it is.'" The entries ended abruptly 2 days before her death. Graves exhaled slowly. "That settles it. There's no question of suicide now." Miss Marple's eyes remained on the photograph. "No, Inspector," she said quietly. "But there is still the question of why now. Men like Mr. Allen do not suddenly lose control. They plan their outbursts like sermons. He must have learned something that pushed him beyond control." The following morning, Miss Marple accompanied Graves to the station. They summoned Jimmy Allen for another interview. He entered stiffly, his tie too tight, his face pale but composed. "Mr. Allen," said Graves, "we've received a letter from your late wife's mother." Jimmy's eyes flickered briefly, then steadied. "Her mother always hated me. I'm not surprised she's saying things." She also mentioned a son, Caleb. The pause that followed was heavy. "That boy wasn't mine," Jimmy said at last, his voice taut. "And it's not relevant. Amy never wanted to talk about him." "On the contrary," said Miss Marple softly, "she seems to have written about him quite often. In her diary." Jimmy turned toward her sharply. "You read her private things?" "Only those the dead would wish to be heard," Miss Marple replied. "You see, Mr. Allen, the truth of a person is like embroidery on fine linen, visible on both sides, though the back tells a different story." He said nothing, but a tremor passed through his hand. Graves leaned forward. "Your wife's diary mentions a quarrel 2 nights before she died. She wrote that you had found messages between her and a man named George Langford. Do you deny that?" Jimmy's eyes dropped to the table. "People say things when they're upset." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly, "but not all people end up dead afterwards." As the interview ended, Jimmy was escorted home under watch. Miss Marple lingered behind, gazing out the station window where rain streaked against the glass. "She tried to leave him, you know," she murmured. "That's what the letter from Florida really tells us. The night she died, she must have made up her mind to go. The quarrel wasn't about betrayal. It was about freedom. And freedom, Inspector, is the one thing tyrants cannot forgive." Graves looked at her thoughtfully. "You think he killed her when she told him?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that he tried to silence her. But some voices travel farther in death than in life." She folded the letter once more, gently as though tucking a child into sleep. "Amy Allen has spoken," she said softly. "Now it is our duty to listen." Chapter 6. The Rope That Couldn't Hang. The morning sky over Elmford hung low and grey, a ceiling of clouds pressing down on the quiet street. The police vans returned to the Allen house with an air of grim purpose. It was the day of the reconstruction, an attempt to settle once and for all whether Amy Allen's death could have been self-inflicted. Miss Marple stood at the gate, a shawl drawn close against the chill. Her expression was mild, almost detached, but her eyes were alert. She watched as Inspector Graves and 2 constables carried a ladder, measuring tape, and a bundle of thick cord into the cellar. "It is strange, Inspector," she said gently, "how murderers so often rely on the clumsiness of others. They expect us to see what is placed before us, not what must be reconstructed to make sense." Graves smiled thinly. "Well, let's see what the physics say, shall we?" The cellar was cold, its air smelling faintly of damp stone and stale earth. The low beams stretched across the ceiling, rough and splintered, the same one where Amy had supposedly tied the cord. Miss Marple had to stoop as she entered, her umbrella tapping lightly on the floor. Graves gestured to the constable. 7 feet 3 inches. Mrs. Allen was 5'6". According to Mr. Allen, she tied the cord here, made a noose, and stepped off a small pail. The constable placed the pail beneath the beam. Miss Marple observed quietly as the rope was looped around the wood. The constable then stepped onto the pail, mimicking Amy's height. His shoes still brushed the floor. Graves frowned. "So she couldn't have hanged properly?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Precisely. If her feet touched the ground, she could not have lost consciousness by suspension alone. The pressure would be insufficient. Even the faint bruise on her neck confirms that." She looked toward the far wall, her eyes narrowing. "May I see that beam again, Inspector?" The constable fetched a stepladder, and Miss Marple, delicate but determined, pointed to a small indentation near the rope's mark. "There," she said softly. "That's not a knot's impression, it's a dent. Something heavy struck the beam before the cord was tied." Graves looked closer, running his hand across the wood. "You're right. That's fresh damage. Could be from a hammer or handle. Or," Miss Marple murmured, "from the end of a broom or bar used to fasten the rope after the fact. Whoever tied it wasn't standing on that pail." Graves stepped back, considering. So she was already unconscious, or dead, before the rope was fixed. Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly. The cellar tells its story plainly, Inspector. One simply has to listen." While the constables photographed the evidence, Miss Marple wandered slowly through the rest of the cellar. Her gloved fingers trailed lightly along the shelves, bottles, tools, boxes stacked neatly, far too neatly for a home recently struck by tragedy. Her gaze fell upon a half-empty tin of grease and a folded rag, both faintly smudged with dust. "Grease?" she asked softly. Graves turned. "Yes, found that last time. He said he used it for the garden tools." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Curious, isn't it? There was a grease stain on the bottle of his wife's perfume upstairs. One hardly expects a lady to mix scent and machinery, but one might expect a man to leave his fingerprints of carelessness in both places." The inspector blinked. "You're suggesting he tied the rope after killing her and handled her things to make it look as if she'd done it herself?" "I'm suggesting," said Miss Marple gently, "that he forgot one simple rule: deceit, like grease, clings longer than we imagine." They emerged from the cellar into the pale daylight. Jimmy Allen was waiting by the front gate, arms folded tightly across his chest, his expression drawn and wary. "Still dragging this out?" he said bitterly. "Haven't you humiliated me enough?" Graves ignored the outburst. "Mr. Allen, we're simply ensuring all details are consistent with your account. Perhaps you'd care to explain how your wife managed to hang herself from a beam that's nearly at her own height?" Jimmy's eyes flashed. "You're twisting everything. She'd been drinking. She wasn't thinking straight." Miss Marple's tone was as mild as tea on a winter's morning. "That may be, Mr. Allen, but drink rarely alters the laws of height and distance, unless, of course, someone helped her." He turned sharply. "Helped her?" "Only in the final sense," she said quietly. He opened his mouth to protest, then caught the inspector's cold stare and fell silent. The moment stretched. The drizzle had started again, each drop tapping faintly against the iron gate. Graves spoke finally, his voice hard. "You'd best not leave town, Mr. Allen." Jimmy's shoulders stiffened. "I wasn't planning to," he muttered, then stalked back inside. The door shut behind him with a hollow sound that echoed down the lane. That evening, at Mrs. Cray's sitting room, Miss Marple sat before the fire, a small smile playing about her lips. Judith, ever curious, poured tea and asked, "Aunt Jane, you seem quite satisfied. Have you solved it already?" "Oh no, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "Solving a murder is much like knitting. One must untangle the thread before the pattern emerges, but I do believe the knot is beginning to loosen." She leaned back thoughtfully. "The rope that couldn't hang tells us more than a confession ever could. A lie, you see, is rather like that rope, too short to suspend the truth and too weak to hold its own weight." Judith stared at her, half in awe. "Do you think the inspector will arrest him?" "In time," said Miss Marple, her eyes glinting. "But patience is the friend of justice, and justice always arrives, though sometimes it prefers the quiet door at the back of the house." Later that night, as the rain deepened into a steady whisper, Miss Marple opened her notebook and added a single line beneath her earlier notes. The rope that could not hang was meant only to stage despair. The cellar tells no lie, Bonty, but the husband does. She underlined the word husband, then closed the book with quiet finality. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolled 11. A slow, solemn sound that seemed to mark the beginning of an end. Chapter 7. The Calm Before the Verdict. The trial was not yet begun, but the village of Elmford already had its verdict. Behind lace curtains and garden gates, voices lowered to murmurs whenever the name Allen was spoken. To some, he was the picture of a tragic husband wronged by life. To others, a man whose control had finally turned to cruelty. Miss Marple, who disliked gossip but studied it as carefully as a scholar studies evidence, knew that both were often true at once. Inspector Graves stopped by Mrs. Cray's house that grey morning, with a weary smile and a folder under his arm. "It's nearly done," he said. "We'll have the report from the forensic engineer this week. They recreated the scene precisely, and it supports everything we suspected. The beam couldn't bear her weight at that angle. No way she tied that cord herself." Miss Marple poured him tea, her expression thoughtful. "Proof, then," she said softly. "The kind the world respects, though truth has been whispering to us for some time." Graves smiled faintly. "You were right from the start, Miss Marple. I don't know how you do it. See what others miss." "My dear Inspector," she replied with gentle amusement. "I've had a great many years to observe the nature of human beings. In a village, or a marriage, one learns that lies are like weeds. They grow fastest in perfect lawns." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk past the Allen house. The curtains were still drawn. A black ribbon had been tied to the gatepost. The sight of it stirred a pang of sadness rather than satisfaction. A soft voice called from the neighbouring garden. It was Mrs. Harker again, clutching a shawl around her shoulders. "They say he's leaving," she said quietly. "Back to America. Or was it Florida? Can't bear to stay in that house, they say." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and the guilty rarely can bear to remain among the walls that know their secret." She looked at the empty windows a long while before turning away. "But truth," she added quietly, "always finds the courage to stay." Well, the next day, Inspector Graves sent for her. "Something's come up," he said when she arrived at the station. "We've been reviewing his interviews. There's a line that didn't strike me before." He opened a folder and read, "I went upstairs to watch the Jim Carrey film, Ace Ventura." Graves looked up. He said that during his first statement. But when the timelines compared with the security footage from the bar, it doesn't add up. He couldn't have gone straight home. He was parked half a mile from the bar for almost 20 minutes after she left on foot. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. Ah, so the mind rehearses grief even before the body performs it. That delay, Inspector, was the interval where he prepared his story. She leaned closer. And may I suggest you look again at his car? We already did. Then do so again. Men who move a body in panic often forget that the smallest details betray them. Grease, perhaps dust, or something as simple as the scent of perfume. Graves stared. The perfume bottle on the shelf. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. It had a thumbprint in grease, remember? The same kind you found on the garden tools in the cellar. Mr. Allen must have transferred her body before staging the scene, using the same hands that fixed his lies. That evening, as rain pressed softly against the windows, the inspector returned to the Allen property with a warrant. The car had been cleaned, but not well enough. Beneath the driver's mat, the technicians found faint traces of long blonde hair, entangled with dust, and a small droplet of dried perfume, evidence of movement after death. Miss Marple received the news calmly over tea. So, she said, the house did not kill her after all. The house merely held the echo. Graves nodded. He'll be arrested tomorrow. The autopsy now reads asphyxiation by manual strangulation. We'll charge him with murder. The next morning broke sharp and bright, the sky scrubbed clean of cloud. Elmford Lane glistened after rain. The village stirred, unaware that before noon police cars would again stand at the Allens' gate. Miss Marple watched from Mrs. Cray's window as the officers led Jimmy Allen, pale and silent, into the waiting car. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, like a man whose arrogance had finally met something greater than itself. When he glanced back once toward the house, his expression wasn't grief. It was disbelief, as though the walls themselves had betrayed him. Miss Marple watched until the car turned the corner and was gone. Then she sighed softly. Such a foolish man, she murmured, to think that love can be locked up like a bird and not expect it to one day sing for its freedom. That evening she dined quietly with Mrs. Cray. The fire burned low and the sound of the rain had returned, steady and unhurried. Judith, slicing bread, said, "So it's really over then? Justice done?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Justice, my dear, is never truly over. It lingers like scent upon a hand that has held perfume. But for now, yes, the calm has returned." Her gaze wandered toward the window, where mist had begun to gather once more over Elmford Lane. "I sometimes think," she said softly, "that murder is never about hatred, but about possession. The murderer loves too much, only he loves himself more." Judith was silent a moment. "You almost sound sorry for him." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I am sorry. But not for the man he was, for the man he might have been. Had he ever learned that love and control are never the same thing? Chapter 8. The Truth in the Shadows. The courtroom was hushed, the air thick with the kind of silence that only falls when everyone already knows the answer. Rain lashed softly against the high windows, and beyond the glass the trees of Elmford bent under the wind like witnesses bowing in reluctant agreement. Miss Marple sat quietly among the observers, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. She had no taste for the spectacle of justice, but she had come nonetheless. Not for the verdict, but for the truth. Jimmy Allen sat at the defense table, pale and composed, his gaze fixed on the judge with a mechanical steadiness. There was no remorse in his face, only a hollow bewilderment, as though he could not quite understand how the world had dared to turn against him. The prosecutor spoke with calm precision. "My lord, the evidence demonstrates beyond question that the victim, Mrs. Amy Allen, could not have died by her own hand. The height of the beam, the absence of suspension marks, the bruising pattern upon the neck, and the trace of grease found both in the cellar and upon the perfume bottle all indicate one thing: a staged scene constructed by the accused after the act of strangulation." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Jimmy's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. When the recess came, Inspector Graves joined Miss Marple in the corridor, his face lined with exhaustion. "It's almost over," he said quietly, his solicitors making one last attempt to paint it as an accident. Miss Marple looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Accidents rarely write such long stories, Inspector, but pride does." He nodded. "You should have been on the stand. You've seen through him from the start." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh no, my part in these matters is quite small. I merely noticed the difference between sorrow and performance. True grief forgets how it looks." That evening, the courtroom reconvened for the final session. The judge's voice carried with grave dignity, recounting the evidence: the low beam, the dented bracelet, the bruised wrists, the timeline that betrayed itself, and the lies told too smoothly. As the gavel fell and the verdict was read, guilty of second-degree murder, Jimmy Allen's composure broke at last. He gripped the edge of the table, staring blankly ahead, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time since his wife's death, silence claimed him completely. Miss Marple rose quietly, adjusting her coat. Justice had been served, but in her heart there was no triumph, only the dull ache of pity for all that could have been spared if people learned to see love as kindness, not ownership. A week later, Elmford Lane was itself again. Curtains hung evenly, gossip softened into reflection, and the black ribbon on the Allens' gate was gone. Life, as it always did, resumed its polite routine. Miss Marple walked there one bright morning, the first hints of spring touching the hedges. The Allen house stood empty now, its windows shuttered, its garden overgrown with neglect. Yet in the still air she fancied she could hear the faintest echo of a woman's voice, not crying this time, but free. She was met at the gate by Inspector Graves, carrying a small box of belongings retrieved from the police station. "We're clearing out the evidence," he said. "Found this among her things. Thought you might like to see?" Inside lay a small notebook, Amy Allen's final diary, the pages faintly perfumed. Miss Marple turned to the last entry, dated the day before her death. "If I can find courage tomorrow, I will tell him I'm leaving. I'm not afraid of being alone. I'm only afraid of staying." Miss Marple closed the book gently, her eyes glistening for just a moment. "She found courage," she whispered. She spoke, and he silenced her for it. "But truth, Inspector, has a voice that cannot be smothered." Graves looked at her with quiet respect. "Do you ever tire of being right, Miss Marple?" She smiled softly. "Oh, frequently, but the truth doesn't depend on whether we like it. It depends only on whether we are willing to see it." That evening, she returned to Mrs. Cray's drawing room, where the fire burned low and the rain pattered lightly against the windows. Judith brought her tea, setting it on the table beside the lamp. "Aunt Jane," she said, "I sometimes think you see into people's hearts." Miss Marple chuckled gently. "Oh, no, my dear, I merely pay attention. Most hearts are quite transparent if one looks with kindness instead of curiosity." She sipped her tea, then added softly, "It's remarkable, isn't it? So many tragedies would never occur if people learned to truly listen, not to what's said, but to what trembles beneath it." The firelight flickered across her face, catching the quiet wisdom in her eyes. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wet earth and lilac, the scent, she thought, of forgiveness. In her notebook that night, she wrote her final line on the case. The cellar was not where the crime began, only where it ended. The true darkness lay in the mind that mistook control for love. She closed the book, set down her pen, and smiled faintly into the quiet room. Elmford slept peacefully again, unaware that one elderly woman across the lane had restored its fragile order, not by force or authority, but by understanding the simple, ageless truth that every murder begins in silence and ends when someone dares to listen.